On January 7, 1945, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery addressed a room packed with reporters at his headquarters in Belgium. He had called the press conference himself, determined to clarify the record on the Battle of the Bulge, his part in halting the German advance, and what really occurred when the Americans required assistance. Montgomery wore his signature beret, adorned with 2 badges, and carried an air of confidence, almost casual ease. British and American correspondents sat ready with notebooks, anticipating a standard briefing on enemy losses and territorial gains. Instead, what they encountered nearly shattered the Allied command. Within 24 hours, General Omar Bradley would begin drafting his resignation. Within 48 hours, Winston Churchill would be rushing to preserve the Anglo-American alliance. Within a week, the European command structure would be on the verge of collapse. To grasp the significance of that press conference, the Battle of the Bulge must be understood. On December 16, 1944, Hitler launched his final major offensive in the West. 29 German divisions struck the American lines in the Ardennes forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, achieving complete surprise. Weak American positions were overrun. A 60-mile deep penetration was carved into Allied lines, and the key supply port of Antwerp faced serious threat. Entire American divisions were encircled or routed within the first 48 hours. It became the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the U.S. Army in World War II, with over 89,000 American casualties in 6 weeks. The opening days were filled with chaos, panic, and desperate fighting amid snow and fog. On December 20th, for days after the German assault began, Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower made a controversial choice. The German Bulge had split the American front in 2, making communication between Bradley's headquarters in Luxembourg and the Northern American forces difficult and unreliable. Eisenhower temporarily placed the Allied forces north of the penetration under Montgomery's command, including the U.S. First Army under General Courtney Hodges and the U.S. Ninth Army under General William Simpson, both of which had previously been under Bradley's leadership since Normandy. Bradley was enraged. He insisted the communication issues were temporary and manageable, and warned that handing American armies over to a British general would be interpreted as a public rebuke of American leadership, politically explosive back home. Eisenhower, however, justified the decision on operational grounds. Montgomery's headquarters were closer, allowing for more effective coordination of the northern defenses. Bradley understood the optics immediately. The Americans had been caught off guard and battered. Now a British general was brought in to fix the situation. Montgomery arrived at Hodges' First Army headquarters on December 20th, like a man sent to rescue a sinking ship. He later described the scene as one of total disarray, with American commanders uncertain of their units' locations. Montgomery's chief of staff noted Hodges was exhausted and hesitant. Montgomery quickly set about reorganizing the defense, consolidating American units into stronger lines and preparing reserves for counterattacks. Montgomery's efforts in the northern sector were competent, stabilizing the defense and coordinating the British 30th Corps as a strategic reserve. Yet the true hero of the Battle of the Bulge was George Patton. On December 19th, just 3 days after the German attack began, Patton performed a remarkable maneuver. He disengaged 3 divisions from his Third Army, pivoted them north, and marched them 100 miles through harsh winter conditions to strike the German southern flank. On December 26, Patton's forces reached Bastogne, relieving the surrounded 101st Airborne. By early January, Patton advanced from the south, while Hodges' First Army pressed from the north, trapping the Germans between 2 converging American armies. By January 3rd, the German offensive had clearly failed, and the crisis was over. It was at this point that Montgomery chose to hold his press conference. He aimed to correct misconceptions, give credit where due, and highlight the British contribution. His staff advised caution, warning of American sensitivities, and suggesting Eisenhower handle public statements. Montgomery dismissed their concerns. On January 7, 1945, he faced the press, notes in hand, clear on what he intended to say. He was determined to set the record straight. Montgomery began by recounting the German offensive and explaining how he had taken command of the northern sector. Then he said something that made the American reporters sit up straighter. "The battle has been most interesting, possibly one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled." One of the most interesting battles he had handled. Not Hodges, not the American forces, but him. He continued, "The first thing I did was to get the battle area tidy, to get it sorted out." He detailed how he had organized the American units, positioned reserves, and prepared for counterattacks. All in the first person, all focused on what he himself had done. Montgomery went on, "I took certain steps myself to ensure that if the Germans reached the Meuse River, they would certainly not get across it. I deployed the whole available power of the British group of armies. And finally, it was put into battle with a bang." He was presenting British forces as a decisive factor. American correspondents began scribbling notes more quickly, aware that controversy was brewing. Then Montgomery said the words that would ignite the real storm. "I employed the whole available power of the British group of armies." This power was brought into play very gradually, in a way that would not interfere with the American lines of communication. Finally, it was put in with a bang, and today British divisions are fighting hard on the right flank of the 1st U.S. Army. You have thus the picture of British troops fighting on both sides of American forces who have suffered a hard blow. This is a fine Allied picture. The Americans understood immediately what it implied. They had been hard hit, unable to manage the situation themselves, and the British commander had stepped in to organize, protect, and save them. American soldiers had already endured 6 brutal weeks in the snow, fighting against overwhelming odds, and now Montgomery was presenting himself as their savior. It got worse. Montgomery continued, "The battle has been a great Allied victory. I think the operations to seal off the salient now being carried out are being very well handled by General Bradley." Now, Bradley was only mentioned as managing operations after Montgomery had supposedly fixed everything. When a reporter asked about Patton's role in relieving Bastogne, Montgomery's acknowledgment was brief and dismissive. "Patton has done very well indeed." Then he returned to recounting his own actions and decisions. The British press loved it. London newspapers ran headlines praising Montgomery for saving the Americans. "Monty clears up the mess," read one. "British general rescues Yanks," proclaimed another. British correspondents wrote stories portraying Montgomery as the seasoned professional who had rescued inexperienced Americans. The tone was triumphant, even gloating. After 5 long years of war, the British public, sensitive about being overshadowed by the Americans, embraced him as a hero once more, just as they had after El Alamein. He had shown those arrogant Americans who the real soldiers were. The American reaction, however, was volcanic. Correspondents present at the press conference immediately filed reports highlighting Montgomery's arrogance and his dismissal of American contributions. They emphasized his repeated phrase, "I handled," throughout the remarks. Within hours, American newspapers ran editorials condemning the press conference. The tone was one of shock and anger. After American troops had borne the brunt of the German offensive, after they had fought and died, Montgomery was claiming credit. Military papers, such as Stars and Stripes, were particularly harsh. GIs in Europe read his statements and were furious. They had fought the Battle of the Bulge, held Bastogne, and stopped the Germans. Yet a British general was taking the credit. General Omar Bradley read the reports at his headquarters in Luxembourg. He had tolerated Montgomery's arrogance for 2 years. The condescension, the credit-stealing, the barely disguised contempt. He had swallowed his pride when Eisenhower had assigned Montgomery command of his armies. He had accepted the implied criticism of his leadership. But this press conference was the final straw. Bradley sat down and began drafting his resignation as commander of the 12th Army Group. He would not serve under these conditions. He would not watch Montgomery claim credit for American victories. He called his staff together and explained his intentions. His chief of staff and army commanders supported him. If Bradley resigned in protest, other senior American generals would likely follow. When Eisenhower learned that Bradley was preparing to resign, he realized he faced the gravest crisis of his command. Bradley's resignation would spark a massive Anglo-American political storm. Congress would demand investigations. The American public would be outraged, and the alliance itself might be imperiled. Eisenhower called Bradley asking him to hold off and promising a resolution with Montgomery. Bradley agreed to wait 48 hours. Then Eisenhower called Montgomery. The conversation was tense. Eisenhower informed him that his press conference had ignited a firestorm. American generals were threatening to resign, and the command structure was on the brink of collapse. Montgomery seemed genuinely taken aback, almost puzzled. He insisted that he had been trying to praise the American soldiers. He had described it as a fine Allied picture and called it a great victory. What could possibly be the problem? Eisenhower attempted to explain the issue. The tone of Montgomery's remarks, his repeated use of the phrase "I handled," the implication that the Americans could not manage without British assistance, and his dismissive treatment of Patton's achievement. All of it amounted to an insult that American commanders could not accept. Montgomery still did not fully grasp the impact of his words. He agreed to issue a clarification, though he did not believe it was necessary. In his view, the American reaction was oversensitive and politically motivated. Winston Churchill, however, immediately recognized the seriousness of the crisis. He had spent years nurturing the Anglo-American alliance and knew how vital American support was for Britain's survival. He understood that if the situation escalated, it could damage relations for years. On January 18, 1945, Churchill rose in the House of Commons to deliver a speech on the Battle of the Bulge. Every word had been carefully chosen, knowing it would be scrutinized by the Americans. His aim was to repair the damage Montgomery had caused. Churchill lavished praise on American leadership, emphasizing that the battle had largely been an American fight. He made clear that Montgomery's role had been supportive and temporary, giving full credit to Eisenhower, Bradley, and the American soldiers. The Americans have engaged 30 or 40 men for every one we have engaged, and they have lost 60 to 80 men for every one of ours, he declared. United States troops have done almost all the fighting and suffered almost all the losses. He continued, "I never hesitate to stand up for our own soldiers when their achievements have been neglected or overshadowed, as they sometimes are. But we must not forget that it is to American homes that the telegrams of personal loss anxiety have been going during these last few weeks." Churchill's speech was a masterclass in diplomacy. While he acknowledged Montgomery briefly, the focus remained on American sacrifice and leadership. The message was unmistakable. Britain valued and respected the contributions of its American allies. On January 21st, Montgomery finally issued his own clarification. It was less an apology than an explanation of his intentions. He stressed his admiration for American soldiers and their commanders. Yet even in this clarification, he could not resist highlighting his own perspective. He described himself as absolutely devoted to Ike and praised Eisenhower as one of the great Allied leaders, a phrasing that suggested Montgomery saw himself as Eisenhower's equal, if not superior. American commanders read Montgomery's clarification with dissatisfaction. They recognized that he still did not understand the extent of his misstep. He continued to believe he had saved the Americans at the Bulge. After Churchill's speech and Montgomery's clarification, Eisenhower returned to Bradley. He explained that he had done everything possible to mend the damage and asked Bradley to withdraw his resignation for the sake of Allied unity and the war effort. Bradley agreed, but only after Eisenhower promised that Montgomery would never again command American forces except in the most extreme emergency. Eisenhower gave that assurance. From that point on, Montgomery would command only British and Canadian troops. Bradley also demanded that Eisenhower retain personal command of the Allied offensive into Germany, with no more temporary arrangements giving Montgomery expanded authority. Eisenhower agreed. The consequences of Montgomery's press conference lingered for the rest of the war and beyond. American generals who had once merely tolerated him now actively despised him. Bradley refused to be in the same room with Montgomery unless Eisenhower was present. Patton turned Montgomery into a running joke, and witticisms about British caution and arrogance spread through every American mess hall in Europe. The British-American alliance survived, but it bore lasting scars. American commanders became more sensitive to British criticism, while British commanders grew cautious in public statements. The easy cooperation of earlier years gave way to formal correctness and careful diplomacy. Montgomery himself never fully understood what he had done. In his post-war memoirs, he recounted the Battle of the Bulge as if his role had been decisive. He genuinely believed he had rescued the Americans from disaster, interpreting the outrage over his press conference as oversensitivity and political manipulation. History, however, has been less kind to Montgomery's claims. Modern historians recognize that while he performed competent work in organizing the northern sector, the battle was won primarily by American forces. The troops who held against the initial German assault, the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, and Patton's dramatic relief operation. Montgomery's contribution was organizational and defensive. He helped stabilize a chaotic situation, but he did not save the Americans. American soldiers saved themselves, aided by Allied air power once the weather cleared, and by Patton's bold counterattack. The British forces Montgomery deployed arrived only after the crisis had passed. They fought effectively in the final stages, but they were not the decisive element Montgomery claimed. Montgomery's press conference is significant because it exposed a deep tension within the Anglo-American alliance. The British had been at war since 1939. They possessed experience, professional armies, and generals hardened in North Africa and Italy. They sometimes viewed the Americans as brave but inexperienced. The Americans, by contrast, had vast resources, fresh armies, and were supplying most of the manpower and equipment for the final push into Germany. They resented being treated as junior partners by allies who could not have continued the war without their support. Montgomery's remarks brought this tension to the surface in the most damaging way. His words confirmed every American suspicion about British arrogance, and his inability to grasp why they were offensive made matters worse. The crisis also highlighted the challenges Eisenhower faced as supreme commander. He had to balance competing national interests, manage high-ranking generals with strong personalities, maintain alliance cohesion, and conduct successful war, all at the same time. When Montgomery triggered a political storm with his press conference, Eisenhower was forced to step in and repair the damage. He succeeded in preventing a rupture in the alliance, but at a cost. His promise to Bradley that Montgomery would never again command American forces limited his operational flexibility. His need to preserve American confidence meant he could not give Montgomery the concentrated thrust toward Berlin that Montgomery desired. The broad front strategy Eisenhower pursued in 1945 was in part dictated by political necessity following the press conference. He could not appear to favor a British general who had just insulted the Americans. The ultimate irony is that Montgomery's press conference achieved the opposite of what he intended. He wanted to highlight British contributions in the Battle of the Bulge. Instead, he created a situation where British efforts were minimized and resented. He aimed to enhance his reputation as a great general. Instead, he convinced American commanders that he was arrogant, tone-deaf, and untrustworthy. He wanted to assert that British leadership remained vital to Allied success. Instead, he ensured that British influence would be curtailed for the rest of the war. On January 7, 1945, Bernard Montgomery held a press conference that lasted less than an hour. In that brief span, he brought the Allied command to the brink of collapse. He turned American generals permanently against him. He forced Winston Churchill to expend political capital to repair the damage. He constrained his own authority for the remainder of the war, all because he could not give credit gracefully, could not downplay his own role, and could not understand how his words would be perceived by exhausted American soldiers who had just survived the largest battle their army had ever fought. The press conference that almost destroyed the Allied command is a stark reminder that in war, as in all human affairs, how something is said matters as much as what is said. Sometimes the wisest course for a leader is to remain silent and let others receive the credit. Montgomery never learned that lesson. On January 7, 1945, his inability to grasp basic human psychology nearly cost the Allies their unity at the moment they needed it most. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. See you in the next video.